You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 2nd of November 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 3 days until Election Day. Early voting closed last night, but we're back and broadcasting from the Beltline here in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a special edition of the Monocle Daily, live from Atlanta, and it starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from the Beltline in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord.
And I'm senior foreign correspondent, Carlotta Rebello. With both candidates in Georgia this weekend, we hear from two leading journalists about how the campaign has shaped up so far, what Atlantans have been saying, and what it's been like to cover this election cycle.
Plus, a pollster unpacks the numbers for us, and we'll cross to our man in Milwaukee, who's been at one of the last Harris rallies right before the big day.
Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily, live from Atlanta.
Welcome to a special edition of the Monocle Daily, coming to you live from the Beltline in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Christopher Lord, and I'm joined today, I'm very pleased to say, by Carlotta Rebello. Carlotta, first time for you in Atlanta. It's not my first. Just some impressions, first of all. We've obviously had many visits by the leaf blowers to our studio. We've managed to chase them off for this show. There is a man with a guitar over there, eager to get back to playing his music as soon as we're off air. But what have you made of this city? What do you think of Atlanta and a bit of that southern hospitality?
Well, there is a reason why it is one of the fastest growing cities in America. There's a lot happening here. It's been an amazing couple of days already. The first time in Atlanta, I've been to the south before, but there is something quite different about the city. People are super friendly and approachable. The amount of conversations that we've had with people here on the Beltline that come over to our studio and speak to us, either curious about what we're doing or like even talking a bit about their thoughts ahead of Election Day. And it's really been interesting just to get a sense of where everyone's head is at and why this is such a popular destination across the country.
And they are energized. That's the thing. You know, we're going into this very, very tight election here in Georgia, but people are engaged with what's happening and they're engaged with us being here. So great to be here, I'd say, Carlotta.
Yes, exactly, Chris. And as we continue to Election Day, the race remains in a dead heat. With a gap between both candidates within the margin of error in most polls, the political landscape in the United States has never been this fractured.
Lindsay Vermeyen is a partner in BSG's California office, and she's a trusted pollster. Great to have you on the programme. First of all, these polls, as we say, very, very close. Is there anything you're seeing, looking across those swing states, standing out to you as something that we should be having our eye on?
They are just so close. It's really a total coin flip, a total toss-up either way. At this point, I don't think we've ever seen polls this close heading into the last weekend before the election, where essentially averages have the candidates tied in every swing state.
And Lindsay, we have early voting, which has closed just yesterday. As we start to get some data from those polls, will it make any difference in what we know? Will we be able to go into Election Day with a clearer view?
It's so hard to say, given that the last election that we have comparative early vote data for was during a global pandemic, when a lot more folks were voting by mail. At this point, I know that Republicans have been outperforming the early vote in Nevada, and I think Democrats are looking to close some of those gaps before Election Day. I think that's a big question mark. If they do, I think Democrats are feeling a lot more confident there, and if they don't, they're feeling quite a bit more pessimistic.
It's been a tricky week in some respects for the Trump campaign, hasn't it, Lindsay? Because, this time last week, they were just preparing for their big Madison Square Gardens event. And of course, then the sort of bomb drops of a big insult to the Puerto Rican community around the US. A few days later, Trump appears in a garbage truck trying to get in. He couldn't even get the door open at one point. It's been a tricky week for them. Are you seeing any change in opinion, especially since that Puerto Rican comment? Has that registered at all in the polls you're seeing?
We have seen in the past few days the polls come out, really just Thursday, Friday, with a very slight edge for Harris. Again, this is all just within margin of error, though, so it's hard to really say if that's a real shift in her direction or not. I think folks that I've been talking to, Democrats I've been talking to, have been feeling slightly more optimistic the latter part of the week than they were at the end of last week or even the beginning part of this week because of those slight shifts. And I think because of how folks are feeling on the ground in terms of the Democratic ground game and their organizing operations and how strongly they're feeling going into this weekend in terms of knocking doors and all that. But it's just so hard to say whether the shifts we're seeing in the polls in the latter part of the week are real or just noise in the ether.
And Lindsay, I wanted to ask you as well about the issue of trust. That's a theme we've been delving deep ever since we've arrived here in Atlanta. And of course, there's already allegations of fraud by the Donald Trump side that has been happening. And we're just curious about, when we have polls that put the gap between candidates always within the margin of error, how do we go about, ensuring the public trusts whatever the outcome will be? Are we able to restore that level of confidence in the numbers?
In terms of polling, pollsters have done a lot since 2016 and even 2020 to help ensure that their methodologies are reaching as representative a group of likely voters as possible. But pollsters are choosing their likely voter universes based on the information they have. And certainly there can be unexpected turnout scenarios and unexpected turnout on election day itself. And so I always like to remind folks that pollsters don't have a crystal ball. Their polling is a snapshot in time. And any given poll that they run represents an electorate that really could show up on election day. Now, that said, I know both sides have really been trying to sort of frame the narrative around whether folks can trust the results or not. Obviously, we've seen a lot from the Trump campaign in terms of putting question marks for their folks on that side. But I know that election officials and everybody working on the Democratic side and lots of Republicans too are really trying to reassure folks that mail-in ballots are going to be counted and we're hoping to restore trust in those institutions as much as we can.
This is a very important swing state, Lindsay, where we are right now here in Georgia. Just give us a picture as you see it, the polls here right now. What are they looking like for Georgia?
In Georgia, the polling averages have had Trump mostly ahead since the middle of September. But that said, it's been by 1 to 2 to 3 points maximum. And so I think Democrats made real inroads in Georgia in the last election cycle, obviously. They had a huge ground game in Georgia. In terms of my gut feeling, having the polls be that consistent for Trump means that he does have an edge right now. But I think Democrats still have a chance. If they go out and turn out folks for this weekend and on election day, then I think we'll be feeling a lot better about Georgia.
Lindsay Vermeyen there, partner in BSG's California office and a trusted pollster. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Great to have you on the program. You're back with the Monocle Daily. Now, as we heard just before the break, polls here in Georgia are profoundly close, and both candidates are rallying hard around this state all weekend.
Early voting closed yesterday with a record turnout here in Georgia, but the race has already been marred by disinformation about illegal voting, and security at polling stations is ramped up.
Well, we're joined now by two journalists who've been closely following this election here in Georgia. Leroy Chapman Jr. is the editor-in-chief of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, one of the city's oldest newspapers. And here with us at the studio is Holly Bailey, a national correspondent for the Washington Post. She covers the South and is based here in Georgia. Welcome, both of you, to the Monocle Daily. Great to have you on the program. Leroy, I just want to start with you. This video claiming to show Haitian migrants illegally voting here in Georgia. Secretary of State for the state, Greg Raffensperger, has said he's trying to get X and Elon Musk to take it down. Has the damage been done, do you think?
Well, yes, to some degree, but also hat tip to Secretary Raffensperger, because he has taken this on. Raffensperger is a Republican who, in his duties as Secretary of State was, but most famously when former President Trump wanted to influence Georgia election results, he said that Georgia would follow the law. So Raffensperger has been very out front about speaking out. Is the damage done? Well, it's there. It's very little defense. And I think this says something also about Elon Musk, the owner of X, This is not the first time we've had something in Georgia that's been a little bit of misinformation that's been amplified by the platform instead of, having what we Georgians want, which is we have credible information and bad actors aren't able to push things to our electorate.
Well, you mentioned bad actors there. The FBI is already saying that there seems to be some kind of trail leading back to Russia with this.
Yes. And again, so if you look back at the congressional inquiry into the 2016 election starting there, there was evidence of it, and there was further evidence in 22 and in 20 and 22. So this isn't new.
And Holly, early voting closed yesterday, record turnout here in Georgia. How are you interpreting those numbers?
Well, obviously, a lot of enthusiasm for this campaign, but I think a lot of people are wondering what Election Day is going to look like here. I mean, if you look at those early voting numbers, both sides find reasons to be positive and both sides find reasons to be negative. The black vote was lower than expected, lower than what the Democrats were hoping for. So on Tuesday, do we see a surge of black voters? I think there's just a lot of lack of clarity about what we're going to see on Election Day.
Leroy, anything to add on that? I mean, are you hearing a very engaged electorate here? Was that record number not a surprise to you?
Not a surprise, given how much money is being spent to rally voters and how much time is being spent by the candidates. But I will say this: I mean, the black vote is an indicator, but I think if we go back 2 years and look at what happened with a gubernatorial race, a statewide race, and also with the race for U.S. Senate, Raphael Warnock won, a Democrat, and Brian Kemp won, a Republican. And there was a sliver of voters who basically split their tickets. It may be harder to get this in polling, but I really think that's going to be a decisive group of people. And if you're the Democrats, you want those folks to continue to split their tickets as they did 2 years ago. And if you're President Trump, you hope to bring those voters home because they were decisive.
One thing that's just amazed Carlotta and I being in Georgia and in Atlanta here is, you turn on the TV, it is relentless, the amount of adverts that are going on here. Both candidates, I think they've been in this state around 40 times collectively since, more than that now, since August. Extraordinary number. Holly, is there a sort of exhaustion that sets in? You're in a swing state here. It is so important. There is so much focus. Now we're talking about potential Russian disinformation coming into this. People, are they worn out by this here?
I think you get a sense of people being worn out and wanting it to be over. We were speaking before the show about how I moved to Atlanta about a year ago, and it's my first time in a battleground state. And the amount of mail that I've gotten, the amount of text that I've gotten, the amount of phone calls that I've gotten, it's extraordinary. And I feel like everybody in Georgia is getting it. And so essentially, I do think that there is level of exhaustion, but I also think that there's a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen. I mean, again, I think people can see two different ways that this could go, and some people feel positive, some people feel negative. People are just a kind of a ball of nerves right now.
But it's remarkable that despite that bombardment of information from both sides, there's still quite a high level of disengagement, but particularly between younger voters between 18 to 19-year-olds whose registration actually went down here in Georgia. So I'm curious how you read this disengagement and disengaged voters. If the relentless of the messaging is not cutting through, where do we go from here?
Well, when you talk to people, especially, I mean, one of the things that I've been focusing on in recent days are the suburbs north of Atlanta, which are incredibly diverse, and it's the suburbs that have decided this race often in Georgia. But talking to people there, I mean, they note that concern about the sort of disengagement among young people. They talk about what's causing it. Some, when they've knocked doors, they've come across people who are upset about the Middle East, and don't feel like either candidate's going to vote their way. And, at the same time, I think that there's some holding out of hope that, some of these people that are registered will ultimately turn out. But again, we just sort of have to wait to see what happens Tuesday.
One of the things that I've found incredible looking through, not least your paper, Leroy, just looking at some of the reporting about the security that's been put in place now on polling stations. I mean, there's over $2.4 million on increased security here in Georgia. Not least panic buttons inside polling stations. I mean, just give me your view here. What are you expecting come election day? I mean, certainly everybody seems to be prepared for the worst. I mean, what's your read on where this ends up in terms of those concerns about potential violence, potentially things boiling over at the polling stations?
Well, we're hoping for the best, but I think we are aware that anything can happen. It may not take a grand conspiracy for something awful to happen. It can take a lone actor who can, I mean, we've seen this time and time again, just in American life and now around American politics. So we stay vigilant. And I think that looking at what we're doing on a state level, what we're doing on a federal level, what we're doing on a local level, it is to take all precaution. All that said, I think there's a good sharing of information here in Atlanta. So Atlanta hosts high-level events. We host Super Bowls, and we'll have the World Cup. So there's already, a lot of law enforcement protocol that will look for bad actors who might want to stage political violence in Atlanta. And we recognize that if someone were to do something, Atlanta probably is one of the places you would go, just given, where we are.
And Leroy, earlier Holly was saying how, for her, this is the first time she's reporting from a battleground state. And, the reason why we wanted to hear from both of you, journalists who are here covering this. But in your case, this is not your first rodeo. So I'm curious, the differences that you're seeing in this election cycle compared to previous ones. What are some of those key factors that have changed?
I think that's the scale of the money being spent. That's different because it's always been important, but there's just more money in politics this cycle. So the money is showing up in media. So that's a difference. So that's one key difference. I think another is really the voters being targeted in a way now where it is text, it is emails in a very surgical way. So that's a tactical thing that both parties are employing. So voters here are seeing that. So some of the fatigue now is not just, can I turn my television off? The campaigns have adapted. We have a large number of people. You talk about those young voters who are disengaged. Well, they consume information in a different way and in a way that politics just hadn't been accustomed to reaching voters because television is the primary driver. So what we're seeing now is a different way. So it's harder to escape. Because now with phone numbers, they're able to flood you with social media, with direct text. So that is a big difference. So when you talk about either fatigue or engagement, it is different now because of the way that campaigns have adapted to communicating with the electorate.
Holly, one of the things that brought you here to Georgia was the profound level of court cases that are floating around Donald Trump right now, former President Donald Trump, and the people around him after 2020 in the election. And Georgia has been the site of that. Now, obviously, it's a very complex case, and it isn't over. Just briefly, if you could, just give us a sense of where this goes from here. Assuming, let's just say, give us both options here. If he wins on Tuesday or down the line, what does that mean for the ongoing cases here? And if he doesn't, then essentially that all comes flooding back, doesn't it? We've sort of put a pause on it, haven't we, while this election's been going on in a coverage sense, but it's still been rattling on in the background.
It has been rattling on. And I guess, the big unknown is what happens if Trump wins. Fani Willis, who is the Fulton County District Attorney, said earlier this week that she plans to try to proceed with the case. Trump's lawyer here in Georgia has indicated that he's going to file a motion to say he can't be sort of tried when he's president. Now, if he loses, the case in theory would proceed, but it's also on pause right now because Trump and his allies are trying to get Fani Willis off the case. So there's a lot of unknowns. Many unknowns, I would say, but it is still in the background, and I think it's still very ever present in the mind of Trump and many of his allies who are charged, who are also very active in this campaign here in Georgia.
And who are in hot water. I mean, we've had the extraordinary situation with Rudy Giuliani, one time mayor of New York, who's now had to hand his apartment over to Georgian electors, hasn't he?
Yes, and they're going after his second apartment in Florida and the accounts of his corporations. It's an unlikely tale that I think people who have followed the former mayor, are surprised by at every level. But it is a constant drama, all of that cases.
It is, and he's irrepressible. I mean, he showed up here not so long ago, didn't he, trying to get involved and so on. So he is irrepressible, Rudy Giuliani. Well, Holly Bailey of the Washington Post and Leroy Chapman Jr. of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thank you both for talking to the Monocle Daily.
And welcome back to the Monocle Daily, live from Atlanta. Now, in the closing days, the two candidates are following each other around the country. They're both here in Georgia this weekend. They were just holding dual rallies in Wisconsin. And Monocle's Tomos Lewis was there. Hello, Tomos. Lovely to speak to you today. Tell us about the mood at the Harris rally.
Hi there, Carlotta. Lovely to speak to you too. Yes, as you say, it was kind of an unusual scene here in Milwaukee last night. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris were here sort of at the same time. Donald Trump's speech wrapped up before Kamala Harris took to the stage at the state fairgrounds a couple of miles away from downtown. And, these affairs are sort of pretty long time commitments for the people who lined up. We got there by about 4 p.m. She didn't take to the stage till after 9 p.m. But the mood is still very high. People pretty enthusiastic to see her and to see the lineup, the supporting cast, if you like. Cardi B was there giving a speech that went down really well, really sort of fired the supporters up. And things remain very close here in Wisconsin, as they do in lots of other of the swing states this time around. So there was a real sort of, I think, feeling that the people who had turned up to see Kamala Harris, I met some people, this was their fifth rally coming to see her in Wisconsin, really wanted to make sure, to try at least, that their support would help sort of tip the balance in some way come election day.
And Tom, over on the other side of town, Donald Trump had his own rally. He had a bit of a disaster with his mic, didn't he? At one point, he threatened to knock the hell out of people backstage. What was going on?
He did, and I will say, Chris, I have only some clips of that, and perhaps the sort of more sort of, I don't know how to put it, sort of clip of him fondling his microphone kind of on the stage, which seems to be picked up by his opponents. But I was going to say, when I was listening to Kamala Harris's speech last night, it did feel as though kind of a version of a speech that she's giving quite a lot at these big rallies at the moment. Whereas, it's difficult with Donald Trump because obviously he riffs so much and it's a fairly freewheeling affair each time. And as you say, Chris, that seems to have taken the attention away, this fondling of the microphone, more than actually any sort of, message maybe he would want to give to those people who are still undecided voters here in Wisconsin, who will be all important come election day.
Well, tell us about that, Thomas, because obviously you've been meeting people there on the ground. What are some of the impressions of what you've been hearing? Tell us about who you've encountered.
Yeah, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people by this stage, Carlotta, and it's kind of interesting that a lot of them still don't really know which way to go. Something you hear pretty regularly is that people like this idea of Donald Trump as a businessman, that the cost of living here in Wisconsin is very high, that they want that to change, and that some of them think that the former president, Donald Trump, is the man to do that. A lot of them also say that they don't like his character, the kind of negativity that he brings to the race. They do like Kamala Harris's positivity, her demeanor on the campaign trail, the way that they've been leaning into this idea of joy, putting firmer ideas out there. But a lot of them do say that they still don't really feel like they know her well enough. But this sort of contrast between the tones of the campaigns is something I put to the Republican Party of Wisconsin. I went to a fundraiser at one of the big hotel ballrooms here a couple of days ago, and I spoke to Brian Schimming, the chair of the Wisconsin Republican Party, and I asked him whether he in fact felt that the Republican Party in this election cycle did have a negativity problem.
The Democratic Party is a negativity problem right now. If you look at the polling, they don't win without the visceral hatred that they have of Donald Trump. That's why almost every single ad I've seen from Kamala Harris is an anti-Trump ad. It's not really talking about her future, her ideas. It's why she's avoided a lot of the direct contact with the media, which she's now famous for. So the negativity actually is coming from Kamala Harris now. So not that both candidates aren't employing it, but she cannot win on her Joy and Hope campaign, which is why I think they left that by the side of the road a couple of weeks ago, and now it's just straight on hatred of Donald Trump. And but I don't think I honestly don't think that's enough. I do think it's a unique election in that people know who Trump is. They thought they knew who she was. I mean, I remind people that before she became the nominee, so Biden's still the nominee, her favorable was only 37%. So I think people, I always encourage people, back up and look at what's actually happening here. You had a vice president who was not very popular. You had a president who was Joe Biden, who was very unpopular. It became clear that he could not win, and including against Donald Trump. And so he got, in a 48-hour span, got pushed off his party's ticket, and he's the sitting president. So you have to recreate a candidacy with Kamala Harris, taking somebody who's not popular in the polling. So I think the bump that she had early on in the polling, in fairness, wasn't a bump for her. It was getting rid of Biden. She benefited from that, as any Democrat candidate would have benefited from that. But now reality is hitting. And so she can talk about a joyful campaign all she wants, but people are not joyful at the grocery store right now. They're not joyful with violent crime rates in the cities. They're not joyful about the issue with the border. So all of her talk about joy is not planning out right now. People are not. I always say she and President Biden can have all the press conferences they want, but I always say that there's a grocery store reality test for voters. And when they go to the grocery store after over 20% inflation over 3.5 years, cumulative inflation, which is what inflation is, it's cumulative. So there's not a lot of joy.
Brian Schimming there, the chairman of the Republican Party of Wisconsin, speaking to Thomas Lewis. Thomas, before we let you go, we are going to be seeing you in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of next week. What are your whereabouts until then? What do you have planned?
Well, the plans have been a bit fluid, Carlotta, so far, but I'm hoping to travel to Pennsylvania tomorrow, and then we'll be seeing you, as you say, in DC. But it's been great being here in Wisconsin for about a week and a half, I guess, kind of, given that things are so close here. I went to the unveiling of the big opinion poll in Wisconsin on Wednesday, and that has Vice President Harris up by 51 to 49 to former President Trump, but the margin of error was 4. So the pollster there, Charles Franklin, who's a bit of a known figure here in politics in Wisconsin, was saying that nobody should be surprised at all to whatever happens here in Wisconsin come election night. But yes, it'd be great to discuss that with you and the team, Carlotta, in DC next week.
Tom, Monocle's Thomas Lewis there. Thank you for joining us.
Now, we've been broadcasting this week from Atlanta, and our pop-up studio is in the 4th Ward office, an extraordinary mixed-use development designed by Seattle-based studio Olsen Kundig, which overlooks Atlanta's pedestrianized Beltline.
It's part of a huge project in this part of Atlanta that includes the 4th Hotel. Residential, commercial projects are in the pipeline, and I sat down with the man behind all this, developer Jim Irwin. He's president of New City Properties. He told me how Atlanta, the place he was born and raised, is changing.
What's amazing to think about is this was the part of town that when I was growing up as a child that I was actually not allowed to come to, that I would actually sneak out, not tell my parents where I was going, because there was a great dance hall that was just down the block, and we could sneak in to see great shows. Acts touring all around the country would come there, and it was sort of the place that you would see anything and everything. But when you walked in and walked out, we were all very careful to keep our head down and move quickly. Just because it was sort of post-apocalyptic. It was just literally hundreds and hundreds of acres of former abandoned industrial sites, just a sea of open concrete, and you never really know what you'd encounter. And so I felt very edgy as a kid, I felt like I was being a misfit for coming down here, and that feeling has never really gone away. And the excitement of being able to reimagine that has been a lot of fun.
And so at that time, as you say, there was great nightlife here because it was, in some respects, the wrong side of the tracks.
Sure.
It was a part of town that where you could go and maybe find a bit of counterculture and go out for a night and so on. Were there people living in here at the time?
Not really, honestly. Again, because it was just, 100 years ago, this was all, because of its proximity to the rail tracks, which is now the Beltline, this was all industrial. And so a lot of those buildings had been abandoned, had just become kind of decrepit and let down.
Now, at that point, very few people, I suspect, could have seen the potential, because it was a broken down railroad that wasn't being used, that was essentially sitting on the side of urban decay. When does that picture start to change, and when do you come in on that change?
So I was hired by Jamestown Properties in 2010 to work on the acquisition of what at the time was called City Hall East, which was a 2.1 million square foot former Sears and Roebuck distribution center that had been abandoned for 20 years. The city had purchased the building in 1990 with an aim to turn it into a center of municipal life, but the building was so big that they were unable to figure out exactly how to take it on. And so slowly over time, it had just been used for paper record storage.
We were just down there, and I think I know that's then becomes Ponce Market, essentially,
correct,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Which now is an incredible nexus for this community. There's restaurants there, bars, there's small retail outlets upstairs that are for local makers. It's quite an amazing transformation, and I guess that became a beacon for this area, didn't it?
It really did. It really overnight became the number one tourist attraction and destination for residents in the city. It's still to this day like the number one destination after the airport for Lyft and Uber, and has really become that central gathering place. But what also happened at the exact same moment was the Beltline opened to the city. And for a city that historically is not known for walkability, it overnight transformed into a place where people can just see and be seen, walk, bike, exercise, and just recreate.
And I should say we're right on the edge of the Beltline right now, so it is an incredible thoroughfare for people. It never ever is empty as far as I can see. Whenever I come to Atlanta, you come here, there's always people biking, walking, running, taking their dogs out, or just hanging out. People take time out here and remarkably activate this area, for want of a better word, all the time. So how does that connect with what happened with Ponce, and at what point did you start to think maybe more people want to live here, but there is also a kind of opportunity to work here?
Sure. So what the vast majority of the public knows well when they talk about Ponce City Market is the retail and the ground plane and the market and the sort of the public experience. But what they don't know is that quietly above them in the upper floors, there's over 500,000 square feet of office. And what I experienced leading the project was I felt like I was in the Sahara Desert with the medicine dropper just dripping out this availability, and it was getting sucked up instantly.
As in you couldn't build it quick enough. As soon as it was available,
as soon as it was available, it was leased up. But by just a few large companies, and those companies, the commonality, there are lots of different industries, but the commonalities, the vast majority of them needed to recruit and retain young employees. So some tech companies, but it was also healthcare, all across the board. And they knew that in a building like that, they could actually recruit and retain top talent.
So essentially, you bring the amenities, and they knew that they could get the workforce that they needed to move here, to live here, to engage with that land.
I think you ask in fact, one of the companies, without telling us, blindly went to Georgia Tech and conducted a survey between us and another building that they were looking at. And 9 out of the 10 said they would prefer to work at Ponce City Market because of its old brick character and the authenticity of the structure.
Jim Irwin there, president of New City Properties, speaking to Monocle's Christopher Lord. And that's all for this special edition of the Monocle Daily, live from Atlanta. A big thanks to our guests today, Lindsay Vermeyen, Leroy Chapman Jr., Holly Bailey, Thomas Lewis, and a special thanks to our host here in Atlanta, Jim Irwin too.
Today's show was produced by Carlotta Ribello. Our sound engineers were Sam Impey here in Atlanta and Mariella Bevan back in London.
The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow as we continue to broadcast from Atlanta in the lead up to the election day in the United States. And you can follow all of our coverage by subscribing to the podcast. I'm Carlotta Ribello.
And I'm Chris Lord. Goodbye and thanks for listening.